1907, at 4:30 p.m., the RMS Lusitania steamed into Liverpool for the first time in order to pick up passengers for her maiden voyage. Under the command of Captain James Watt, the Cunard Line had their hopes high for this first crossing on board the Lusitania. But you see, the Cunard Line also had another goal for the Lusitania's maiden voyage. They were hoping that the Lusitania would be able to win the blue ribbon on its first crossing, which would showcase to the world that the Lusitania wasn't only the biggest ship in the world, but she was also the fastest. Now, once the Lusitania arrived in Liverpool and began to pick up passengers, the ship didn't remain in Liverpool for very long. This wasn't like the Titanic's visit to Southampton, where the ship stayed there for around a week while it gathered up supplies and everything like that. The Lusitania was fully stocked and ready to go when it arrived in Liverpool, so the only thing it had to do once it arrived in port was pick up passengers and then head out again. So the ship arrived at roughly 4:30 p.m. on September 7th, 1907, and then by 9 p.m. she had all of her passengers aboard and steamed out of Liverpool to begin her maiden voyage. The next day, the ship arrived in Queenstown, Ireland at somewhere around 9 a.m., and once again, the ship just picked up more passengers, and then around noon, the RMS Lusitania steamed out of Queenstown, heading out into open sea to begin her first voyage across the Atlantic, bound for New York City. Now, for the most part, the Lusitania's first westbound crossing across the Atlantic went pretty smoothly. However, a few days into the voyage, a heavy fog moved in, and as a result of this fog, the Cunard Line had to slow down the Lusitania. This, as a result, would affect the Lusitania's arrival time in New York City, which means that on the Lusitania's first voyage across the Atlantic, the ship failed to win the blue ribbon. However, despite the issue with the fog, the Lusitania's first westbound crossing was a huge success. The Lusitania arrived in New York City on September the 13th, 1907, and the entire voyage took 5 days and 54 minutes to complete. This is still a very impressive crossing time despite the Lusitania being slowed down by fog. And believe it or not, the Lusitania only missed the blue ribbon by just 32 minutes. So even though the Lusitania didn't get the blue ribbon on its first westbound crossing, the Cunard Line was hopeful that the Lusitania would still win the blue ribbon and become known as the fastest and biggest ship in the world. However, despite the Lusitania not winning the blue ribbon, hundreds of thousands of people still came to the pier to marvel at this brand new revolutionary ocean liner. They knew very soon that the Lusitania would claim the blue ribbon and would be the world's biggest and fastest ocean liner. Now, the Lusitania remained in New York City for precisely 1 week, and during that time, the Cunard Line allowed the public to tour the Lusitania. And as a result of this caused the public to fall even more in love with this brand new revolutionary ocean liner. After spending 1 week in New York City, the RMS Lusitania raised anchor and steamed out of New York Harbor, bound for Liverpool once again for her first eastbound crossing across the Atlantic. And just like her first westbound crossing, the Lusitania would also make a quick stop in Queenstown along the way. Now, the Cunard Line hoped that, at least for her first eastbound crossing, maybe, just maybe, the Lusitania could win the blue ribbon for fastest eastbound crossing, if the weather was better, of course. However, the Cunard Line's hopes for this were quickly lost, because once again, the Lusitania encountered a very heavy fog, and the ship had to slow down once again for her first eastbound crossing across the Atlantic. This, as a result, would delay the Lusitania's arrival time. On this voyage, it took the Lusitania precisely 5 days and 4 hours to cross the Atlantic, a few hours longer than her first westbound crossing. So, unfortunately, once again, the Lusitania failed to win the blue ribbon. However, it wouldn't stay that way for very long. In October of 1907, the Lusitania was finally ready to begin another westbound voyage across the Atlantic, and the Cunard Line hoped that this time around, if the weather was better, the Lusitania would finally be able to claim the blue ribbon. And guess what? Cunard Line got their wish. The weather was much better, and the Lusitania was now able to proceed across the Atlantic at her maximum speed. She crossed the Atlantic in just 4 days, 19 hours, and 53 minutes, officially making the Lusitania the fastest ship in the world, and finally securing the blue ribbon for the Lusitania. However, even though the Lusitania had finally succeeded in claiming the blue ribbon, the ship wouldn't be able to hold on to that title for very long, because in December of 1907, the Lusitania's sister ship, the RMS Mauretania, officially entered service and stole the blue ribbon from the Lusitania. However, this didn't bother the Cunard Line that much, because it was the Lusitania's sister ship that claimed the blue ribbon. So as long as the blue ribbon was housed in the same family of ships, this didn't bother the Cunard Line all that much. Now, the Cunard Line would have had no way of knowing this in 1907, but the success of the Lusitania and Mauretania had gotten the attention of one of the Cunard Line's biggest competitors, the White Star Line. You see, they saw the Lusitania and Mauretania as a big threat to their company. So the head of the White Star Line, a man by the name of J. Bruce Ismay, had a talk with J.P. Morgan, the head of IMM, and together they decided that they wanted to build some brand new ships to compete with the Lusitania and Mauretania. So, they went to the head of the Harland and Wolff shipyard, William Peary, and discussed the idea for these new ships with him. And he came up with the idea for a whole new class of liner. A liner designed not to compete with the Lusitania and Mauretania in terms of speed, but to try to outclass them in terms of luxury and size. Now eventually, this whole new class of liner would be called the Olympic class of ocean liners, and it would be comprised of 3 ships. These ships would become known as the Olympic. The second ship would be called the... You know what? I can't remember what this ship was called. I think this ship was really famous for some reason. It's called Titan. It's something like that. Do any of you know? Please let me know in the chat below. And then the third and final ship of the Olympic class would become known as the Britannic. Now, I'm not going to be going into any more detail about these ships in this series because this series is about the Lusitania. However, I've already done complete timeline series showcasing the story of all 3 of these ships. And if you would like to learn more and watch those videos, I will include a link to those videos in the description below. Alright, jumping back to the Lusitania and Mauretania now. Over the next year or so, things proceeded pretty smoothly with both of these vessels, and no major incidents happened. Both ships continued to operate normally, and the public loved sailing on both of these vessels. Now, in the year 1909, the Cunard Line took the Lusitania and swapped out her propeller blades, and believe it or not, the Lusitania was finally able to reclaim the blue ribbon from the Mauretania. However, it only did this with the westbound crossing, not the east. So, a bit of a rivalry broke out between the Lusitania and Mauretania, with each ship trying to outclass the other in terms of speed. And then, believe it or not, in July of 1909, the Lusitania succeeded in taking the entire blue ribbon in terms of both eastbound and westbound crossings from the Mauretania. However, this success was short-lived, because in the exact same month, the Mauretania once again stole the blue ribbon from the Lusitania. Now, the next major event to happen to the Lusitania occurred in October of 1909, when this ship participated in a celebration. You see, in New York City in October of 1909, there was a celebration going on called the Hudson-Fulton Celebration. This celebration was to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the discovery of the Hudson River, and it was also there to commemorate the 100th anniversary of Robert Fulton's first successful commercial application of a paddle steamship. So because they were celebrating this steamship, they also took the opportunity during this celebration to showcase the latest in transportation technology. And this is why the Lusitania was on display during this celebration, because they were using it to showcase the latest in steamship technology. Now, believe it or not, steamships weren't the only mode of transportation being showcased during this event. Believe it or not, the Wright brothers had their very own airplane on display during this celebration. And also, believe it or not, there's a photo of the Wright brothers airplane with the Lusitania in the background. And guys, let me tell you, the historian in me just absolutely loves this picture because, I mean, I never knew about this until I looked into it. And it's so cool to see the Wright brothers airplane and the Lusitania in the same photo side by side. Now, a few months after the Hudson-Fulton celebration, the first real major incident with the Lusitania occurred. On January 10, 1910, while the Lusitania was heading to New York City from Liverpool, the ship encountered a rogue wave roughly 75 feet high. Now, due to the design of the Lusitania, she was able to cut through the wave instead of riding on top of it. However, this came at a cost. As the wave washed over the ship, it slammed into the Lusitania's bridge. This, as a result, damaged the Lusitania's forecastle, and it also smashed every single window on the bridge. Now, the bridge itself was also pushed aft by a few inches. That just showcases the power of this wave. And it also put a permanent depression of a few inches in the Lusitania's decking and the bridge of the ship. However, despite this damage, the Lusitania wasn't at risk of sinking, so the ship continued on to New York. The ship arrived a few hours late, and luckily no one was injured. The passengers of the Lusitania were just a little bit shaken up. After this event with the rogue wave happened, the Cunard Line wasted no time in repairing the Lusitania and getting it put back out to sea as quickly as possible. And honestly, once this was done, things proceeded pretty smoothly with the Lusitania and its sister ship Mauretania over the course of the next few years. The passengers loved sailing on these vessels. Cunard Line was a very popular company to sail with, and yeah, I mean, Cunard Line couldn't ask for a better situation in terms of operating both the Lusitania and the Mauretania. However, that all changed on July 28, 1914, when a certain event occurred that would change the fate of both of these vessels forever.
ये है Motorola G73। इस सेगमेंट में सबसे फास्टेस्ट स्मार्टफोन है। ये इंडिया का सबसे पहला Dimensity 930 चिपसेट वाला स्मार्टफोन है।
इसमें भाई एक फ्लैगशिप वाला कैमरा।
On July 28, 1914, World War I officially broke out and quickly spread across Europe. Now, as a result of war breaking out, it would have a noticeable impact on the entire transatlantic shipping industry. There isn't one vessel operating in the Atlantic that wouldn't be affected by this war in some way. And of course, as you expected, this also means that the Lusitania and her sister ship Mauretania would also be impacted by this war. Not long after hostilities broke out, the British Admiralty contacted the Cunard Line and let them know that they would need both the Lusitania, along with her sister ship Mauretania, to enter service as armed merchant cruisers as quickly as possible. However, not long after this happened, the British Admiralty did some tests with both the Lusitania and Mauretania and discovered that the engines on both of these vessels, well, they really weren't suited to be used as armed merchant cruisers. Where the Lusitania and Mauretania were built to be the fastest ships on the Atlantic, the engines on these ships were efficient in terms of their coal usage if they were doing what they were intended to be used as very fast ships steaming across the Atlantic. The engines were great for this. However, in terms of being used as an armed merchant cruiser, which means that the Lusitania and Mauretania would be on patrol, sailing around the Atlantic very slowly, or these ships would be used as escort ships to help protect a convoy, well, due to the slow speed that these ships would be going at during these time periods, the engines used way too much fuel for this. They just were not practical for this type of usage. So once the British Admiralty realized this, they decided that they did not need the Lusitania and Mauretania, at least during the early stages of the war. And as you can expect, Cunard Line noticed that there was a huge drop-off in civilian passengers wanting to sail across the Atlantic during this time period. I'm not saying that there were no people wanting to sail across the Atlantic during this time period, but there were much fewer numbers than usual. So what the Cunard Line decided to do was put the RMS Mauretania in storage until this ship would be needed later. And then they decided to have the Lusitania continue operating for her transatlantic passenger service. So during the early stages of the war, the Lusitania continued to operate, going to and fro, sailing across the Atlantic, taking passengers from Europe to America and America to Europe. Then, not long after the war broke out, Germany unleashed a new and devastating weapon onto the Atlantic, the U-boat. For those of you who don't know, a U-boat is a German war submarine that was capable of hunting down and torpedoing an enemy ship and causing it to sink. Now at first, the British Admiralty didn't take the existence of these U-boats too seriously. They really didn't think that these submarines could do any major damage to the British fleet. However, as more and more time went by, the UK government saw how many ships that these U-boats were starting to sink. So, as the war continued to rage on, the British Admiralty had no choice but to accept the fact that these U-boats were something to be reckoned with. Alright, so now that we've touched on what the Lusitania was doing during this time period, and now that we've also touched on what U-boats are and why they were considered such a threat, there is one more key thing that we need to discuss before we continue the story of the Lusitania, because by understanding this, you'll have a better understanding of the series of events that are about to occur with the Lusitania. You see, what we need to talk about is a treaty that was signed in the 1800s known as the Declaration of Paris. Now, I'm not going to be going into the full extent of this treaty, but the part of it that you need to understand for this video was that this treaty had very specific rules in place in regards to naval warfare. And this treaty was also signed by 55 countries, including Germany. So that's also a key reason as to why this treaty is a big deal and why it's very important to the story of the Lusitania. Now, the part of the Declaration of Paris that you all need to understand for the story of the Lusitania is a section of this declaration that is known as cruiser rules. And the whole point of the cruiser rules part of the declaration was to basically safeguard civilian vessels and civilian lives during a time of war. So this is the easiest way I can explain it. Let's say you have a warship, okay, and it comes across an enemy civilian vessel. This vessel isn't carrying any armaments whatsoever, it's just full of innocent civilians. Well, Under the cruiser rules, this warship should try to safeguard those civilian lives. So if they decide to sink the civilian ship, they have to make sure that all the civilians get off the ship before it sinks. Or if they wanted to, they could just do an inspection of this ship, make sure this ship wasn't carrying any weapons or anything like that, and then they could leave the ship alone. However, if they found that this civilian ship was carrying weapons, it could be classified as a ship of war and could be sunk. So this is the simplified version of the cruiser rules thing. You know, the only point of this was just to try to make sure that as few civilian lives were lost as possible. However, while on paper cruiser rules obviously make sense, and I'm sure during wars of the past they were easier to enforce, but during the First World War, as war technology was evolving rapidly and there were brand new machines of war being implemented, such as submarines and airplanes, it was getting to be harder and harder to safeguard civilian lives during this time period. This was partly due to the fact that while submarines and airplanes were very good tools of war, the downside of these weapons was that it was harder to use them and fine-tune a target to make sure that you're only taking out a military ship or military installation. So, because of this, it was inevitable that some civilian lives would be lost during this brand new era of technological warfare. Now, while we're on the subject of why both sides had an increasingly difficult time and fine-tuning their targets, there was another issue that came up that made this even worse. You see, during this time period, there were a good number of neutral countries. And when I say neutral countries, I'm referring to countries that weren't directly associated with one side or the other. They were not involved with this war at all. So obviously, these countries weren't to be fired upon by either side. One such country was the United States of America. The U.S. would remain neutral during World War I until the final years of the war. And there's also a clause in the whole Declaration of Paris that helps protect these countries. You see, according to the cruiser rules, all vessels sailing across the Atlantic should have a flag up that lets other ships or U-boats know what country this ship belongs to. So if you have an American ship, it's supposed to have up an American flag. If you have a British ship, it's supposed to be hoisting a British flag, and so on and so forth. This is to help protect the lives of people who aren't involved in this conflict. However, there was this growing issue during this time period where ships would hoist a false flag as a form of camouflage. Now, this directly violated the cruiser rules. This was not to be done under any circumstances because as a result of this, this made it more difficult for both sides to know, if they were firing upon an enemy ship or not. So because of this, there were instances out there where British ships were hoisting American flags. And this became such a problem that U-boat captains started, they were like, okay, I can't tell if that's an American ship or a British ship or not, so these U-boats would just assume the worst and torpedo all ships. So because this was a constantly growing problem, it was inevitable that innocent lives that had nothing to do with this conflict would be lost. Alright, now that we've covered all of that information, we can now continue the story of the Lusitania. Now, for the first 9 to 10 months of the war, the Lusitania was very successful in avoiding trouble. Captaining the ship during this time period was a man by the name of Captain Dow, and he was very well familiar with the Lusitania, and he knew how to operate the vessel safely and efficiently. Now, after World War I broke out, Captain Dow was ordered to sail the Lusitania with no flags hoisted. This was also a violation of the cruiser rules, and Captain Dow strongly disagreed with this decision. However, he was forced to do this, so he grudgingly did it and didn't complain too much. After this happened, he continued to operate the Lusitania without issues. However, the stress of everything that was going on was beginning to get to Captain Dow. In March of 1915, he requested to be granted shore leave from the Lusitania, and this request was accepted. After Captain Dow left the Lusitania, Captain Turner returned to the Lusitania once again, and he would be the captain of the vessel throughout the rest of her career. Following Captain Turner's return to the Lusitania, for the next month or so, everything proceeded pretty smoothly with the ship. The Lusitania continued to operate, sailing back and forth across the Atlantic with no real problems. However, all that changed in May. You see, on May 1st of 1915, the RMS Lusitania was docked in New York City, getting ready to depart for another voyage from New York City to Liverpool. However, what everyone didn't know was that on this particular voyage, the fate of the Lusitania was about to be changed forever. Now, the Lusitania was due to leave New York City at 12 noon on the 1st of May, 1915. However, during the early hours of the morning on this same particular day, this would have been the time period at which all the Lusitania's passengers would have begun to board the vessel. Now, also right around this same time period, the Lusitania received some last-minute and unexpected and top-secret cargo. You see, secretly, the Lusitania was going to take some small arms munitions from the United States to Great Britain to help assist Britain with the war effort. The munitions included 4,200 cases of Remington rifle cartridges, 1,250 cases of shrapnel shells, and fuses. Now, this cargo was to be kept a complete secret because remember, at this time period the US was supposed to be neutral during World War I. And because the Lusitania was carrying these small arms munitions, this was a complete violation of the Cruiser Rules Agreement, which meant that if the Lusitania was caught carrying these munitions, the Lusitania was a viable military target able to be sunk by German U-boats. Now, due to the fact that the Lusitania, a vessel that was supposed to be an unarmed civilian passenger liner, was carrying munitions illegally, would be a source of great controversy in later years. However, we'll talk more about that later. For now, the only thing you need to know is, yes, it was true that the Lusitania was illegally carrying munitions in order to help assist with the war effort. However, before we get more into that, what we need to talk about right now is, due to the fact that the US was technically neutral in World War I at this time period, there was a German embassy located in New York City. And due to the fact that the Lusitania, an unarmed passenger liner, quote unquote, was getting ready to sail across the Atlantic, the German embassy issued out a warning, letting all the civilians who were sailing on board the Lusitania know that a state of war existed between Great Britain and her allies, and that anybody who sails on board the Lusitania was doing so at their own risk. This warning appeared in the New York City newspapers at the time. And for the most part, most of the passengers on board the Lusitania just kind of laughed it off. You know, they were thinking, the Germans can't be serious. They wouldn't torpedo an unarmed civilian passenger liner. There is no way that this could happen. So this was the general consensus of the public at the time. However, there were a few people who were supposed to sail on the Lusitania who took this threat seriously and decided to cancel their voyage on board the Lusitania. Then, at a little bit past 12 noon on the 1st of May, 1915, RMS Lusitania pulled out of the pier and departed New York City, bound for Liverpool for the last time. A couple of hours after the Lusitania departed New York City, she passed a few British destroyers that were just off the coastline, and a crewman on board one of these destroyers took a photograph of the Lusitania as it was sailing out across the Atlantic. This photograph you see here of the Lusitania way off in the distance is the last known photograph to ever be taken of the Lusitania.
ए लड़की तेरा नाम क्या है पूछने वाले पूछे तो बता तेरी पहचान क्या है तेरा नाम गूंजेगा तो उठेगा एक तूफान हिलेगी जमीन मचेगा घम
When we last left the Lusitania, it was May 1st, 1915, and the ship had just departed New York City bound for Liverpool. Now, it was going to take the Lusitania roughly a week to cross the Atlantic and arrive in Liverpool. However, what everybody on board the Lusitania didn't realize was that at the exact moment the Lusitania was leaving New York, on the other side of the Atlantic, German U-boat U-20 had just left its home port and was heading to its patrol zone. And its patrol zone happened to be the area that the Lusitania would be steaming into in about 1 week's time. So, since it's going to take the Lusitania roughly a week to cross the Atlantic, what I thought we would do for this video is go ahead and jump to the other side of the Atlantic and tell a little bit of the history of U-20. Because, believe it or not, U-20 has an incredibly interesting history leading up to the point that it encountered the RMS Lusitania. And then we're going to conclude this video at the exact moment that U-20 encountered the Lusitania. And then in the next episode, we're going to talk about how U-20 eventually found the Lusitania, torpedoed it, and what events led up to the Lusitania eventually sinking after U-20 torpedoed it. Alright guys, well hey, with that out of the way, let's now tell the story of U-20, the submarine that would eventually sink the Lusitania. Now before we begin today's video, I do have one quick disclaimer I need to mention. The stories that I'm going to be telling you in this video are very obscure stories about U-20. And because these stories aren't easily accessible online, in fact, most of the research I did about U-20 came from the incredible book Dead Wake that talks about the final voyage of the Lusitania. And this book doesn't just talk about Lusitania, it also has a pretty detailed account of U-20. I wasn't able to find a lot of photos or pictures of U-20, so I had to improvise a little bit and show some other pictures of different U-boats to help out with the story. So if you notice a few pictures and you know, wait a minute, that's not U-20, just know that I had to improvise a little bit to give you all the content for this video, so give me a little bit of a break there. But yeah, guys, listen, I'm telling you, if you want to learn more about the Lusitania and U-20, the book Dead Wake is incredible, and I would highly recommend it.